Hello everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Hedera Hashgraph's transaction fee system and its importance for enterprise usage and adoption. If you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter, where we put out regular updates about our risk indicators and more. So this might seem like a bit of a peculiar topic, but I think it's one that's interesting that people haven't talked about all that much. The developers have talked about their transaction fee system a little bit and why they favor it, but I think there's more under the hood that can be talked about that people just haven't really discussed. That's actually quite important for understanding demand for the HBAR token and how that could influence price in the future. So for those who aren't familiar, Hedera Hashgraph is a layer 1 protocol. It uses a novel consensus mechanism, Hashgraph, which allows it to have really high throughput and very inexpensive transaction fees. And the unique aspect of Hedera Hashgraph is they actually denominate their transaction fees in US dollars, not in their native token HBAR. And essentially what that means is that a given type of transaction, I'm just showing you an example here of their cryptocurrency transactions and the fees associated. A given type, so for example, a crypto transfer will always cost this fraction of a dollar. So no matter what the price of HBAR is at a given point in time, it will always be this amount. Now you pay the transaction fee in HBARs, but the way it works is that they are hooked up to a data oracle. And I believe it's about every hour the oracle checks what the price of HBAR is. And then you just pay whatever amount of HBAR is $0.00001. That's the amount you'd pay for that transaction fee. So no matter what the price of HBAR is, the dollar amount of HBAR you're paying is always going to be the same. So it's pegged, transaction fees are pegged to the US dollar, which is unique because a lot of other layer 1 protocols, I believe all the other leading layer 1 protocols all denominate their transaction fees in their native token, not in US dollars. So we're going to use Avalanche here as a comparison example. So Avalanche is another alternative layer 1 protocol. And, they use AVAX as the way to determine. So, for example, if you're sending AVAX on the X chain, it's 0.001 AVAX. So that's, if you're just going to send AVAX to someone, it's that many AVAX as a transaction fee. And so what that means is that this is going to be a volatile transaction fee in US dollar terms. It depends what the price of AVAX is. If AVAX is really cheap, transaction fee will be quite cheap. AVAX gets to be really expensive, the transaction fee will become quite a bit more expensive as well. And I think we can see this if we just pit the two against each other and just do some hypotheticals, right? So let's take an asset HBAR at a given price, and let's say that we're trying to budget for a certain number of transactions we want to engage in. So let's say we're an enterprise. Let's say we're a business who's planning on using HBAR in our backend, and we have a certain number of transactions that we want to budget for over a given period of time. So let's say we're budgeting for 10 million transactions. Well, we know that the cost per transaction, let's imagine these are just simple transactions. We know the cost, $0.0001 for every single transaction. That comes out to a total cost of just $1,000 for that 10 million. And this is price invariant. This does not change based on price, right? The price of HBAR can be 1 cent per HBAR or 40 cents per HBAR. Doesn't matter. The same total cost will exist for that number of transactions because the cost per transaction is fixed to the dollar. It's not fixed to the price of HBAR. This is not the case for AVAX. So for AVAX, if we're looking at kind of the current price at around $75, $76, budgeting for 10 million AVAX transactions, that's going to be $758.8 thousand for that 10 million. So the first thing that's going to strike your mind, obviously, is that's a lot more money than HBAR if you're doing that type of transaction, just sending AVAX around. So that's one thing we can note. But then what we can also note is that this depends on AVAX price. If it's $10 per AVAX, it's only $100,000. If it's $150 for AVAX, so roughly 2x's from where it is now, that would be $1.5 million for those 10 million transactions. And what the devs have talked about, the HBAR devs have talked about, is that they want to encourage enterprise adoption of the network of HBAR. They want this to be something that businesses incorporate into their workflows. And the reason that they've given for why they've decided to denominate transaction fees in terms of US dollar and not HBAR amount is exactly this predictability, that you don't need to worry about what the price of HBAR is at a given point in time. You know that you're always going to be spending the same amount of dollars for every single transaction of a given type. Whereas with something like AVAX, it becomes a lot harder for a business to incorporate this into their backend because, they can't budget for cost. And frankly, if the price of AVAX goes up too high, it might not even be economically feasible for them to do it. It might not be profitable anymore for them to be using AVAX on their backend if these transaction fees get too expensive. If the price of AVAX goes up too high, they might not be able to literally afford to use it. And essentially, if you did budget a certain dollar amount that you were willing to spend, the idea is that for AVAX, the amount of transactions you'd be able to do in a given period of time will change based on the price of AVAX. So here I've just fixed the dollar amount to be the same and then just solve for how many transactions you could actually buy with that at different costs of AVAX. And you can see it fluctuates wildly depending on how expensive AVAX is. And the idea that the argument the devs have given, which seems to have merit, is that this type of system is not especially compelling for businesses because it's so unpredictable. You kind of have to constantly worry about what the price of AVAX is. This is very predictable if you're using this in your back end. So that's one kind of reason why this might be a useful way of doing transaction fees, because if you're denominating your transaction fees by your token like AVAX is, you're actually punishing people for using your network when the token price is high. So essentially, the more value that's being put into your network, the more you're disincentivizing people from using it in a high volume type of way. And so essentially what chains like AVAX have decided to do in a way is they're kind of disincentivizing high volume use of their networks in a sense. Because obviously all these chains are trying to grow, they're trying to get their token prices to rise, generally speaking, or at least that's something that is obviously hoped for. Any kind of VC backer getting into these projects, that's what they want to see. Because oftentimes they are given a certain amount of tokens in exchange for their investment. And so with those ones, the use cases of those networks are not very well geared to any kind of use case that requires high volume, because the more people who want to use that chain and then driving up the price of the asset as they might be engaging in a lot of different transactions, that just disincentivizes anyone else from joining that chain because now they're having to spend so much more money to do those transactions. HBAR doesn't have that concern. People can be doing, 1 million, 1 billion, 1 trillion transactions on the network, or people can be, driving the price of HBAR up to any level. But the amount of money that a business needs a budget for any number of transactions they want to do on the network is always going to be constant. It's always going to be predictable. And so that's one of the advantages that HBAR has in that sense. The HBAR, in doing this, has set itself apart from some of these competitors in that it can handle a lot of people using it, driving the price up, while still allowing businesses to have a very predictable budget, basically, for any kind of transaction. So for high volume type of transaction, HBAR has kind of set itself in a particular position. Now, what's also interesting about this system that HBAR has going for it is that it also kind of helps us as investors get at least some senses of some of the monetary inflows that we can expect into HBAR based on the number of transactions that are on the network. And that's because the number of transactions and the transaction fees that are going to be needed to engage in those current transactions is pegged directly to the US dollar. So for 56.4 million transactions, for example, we can figure out how many dollars need to go into HBAR to buy HBAR to pay for that number of transactions. So you have businesses, for example, using HBAR, they're using some number of transactions per month, and that's leading into some total. We can actually calculate how much money they needed to put into HBAR, so basically how much HBAR they needed to buy to be able to engage in that number of transactions. And so you can calculate kind of a minimum monthly inflow, in a sense, into HBAR. Now, I've chosen, as 0.0001. I've just assumed that all 56.4 million transactions in this last month were of the cheapest variety. Obviously, that's probably not the case, so this is going to be the lowest possible end. The idea is that with 56.4 million transactions in a month, that's going to be a 5.6K dollars needed to buy that. That's how much HBAR had to be bought to just do those transactions. Now, obviously, this is not entirely impressive right now, and that's, of course, the thing with HBAR, or with Hedera Hashgraph, is that, I think their ultimate goal is to have so much usage that it would drive up this amount of demand for HBAR, and that would be one thing that could cause HBAR's price to go up, is that if you're suddenly getting, for example, 56 billion transactions per month, add 3 zeros, suddenly now that's $5.6 million that's being put into HBAR tokens just to buy HBAR to actually engage in that number of transactions by the people who are engaging in the transactions. That's kind of a needed amount, that if people are using that many transactions on the network, they need this dollar amount of HBAR to do it. And what's unique about HBAR is that this is a constant inflow. This does not depend on the price of HBAR. HBAR could be 1 cent, HBAR could be $100. You would still be getting $5.6 million of inflow every single month if this is the number of transactions that are being conducted on the network. It's kind of this constant monetary inflow. And one of the kind of interesting things about that is that means that if HBAR's market cap were to start declining, so let's say that there's a lot of monetary outflow, but then there'd be a lot of usage by businesses of the network, that could kind of act as a cushion on the price because you're getting a constant amount of inflow. Whereas with a more variable transaction schedule, like something like AVAX, the lower the token, the less money that's flowing in for a given number of transactions. So one thing I'm pointing out here, just showing coin market cap. So we can see that, HBAR or Hedera has a market cap right now of 3.7 roughly billion dollars. So obviously the current usage of the network, where we're only seeing an inflow of 5.64K minimum flow, is probably actually higher than that, but a minimum inflow of that for just using the network. Obviously this kind of valuation is not going to be something that's directly related to that, right? 5.6K as a minimum value, even if the actual value is a bit higher, is not going to support the asset being valued this highly, right? So if you think of kind of transaction usage as being kind of the minimum fair value, this is obviously going to be way inflated from that. And I think that's really what we have to be, what people who are invested in HBAR have to be clear-eyed about, is that, it's still speculative, that it's still betting on what HBAR could be in the future. It's not what it is right now. I would argue that the amount of transaction usage on HBAR does not justify this level of market cap. This is more about people investing in, hoping that HBAR achieves much more in the future and then actually gets those kind of monthly inflows that would back up a much higher type of market cap. But just something I wanted to point out. But certainly if HBAR did suddenly start getting more usage and were to grow to a much larger size and get a lot more people using the network, we can then just calculate the amount of inflows, and that might start to justify a higher overall valuation of the network. But this is the thing that I think is just interesting to note about this kind of mechanism, is that dollar inflows from transaction fees on HBAR or on their Hashgraph are constant regardless of price, and that allows us to calculate how much roughly dollar inflows are needed to sustain the number of transactions we're seeing on the network. And so if enterprises were to start adopting Hedera Hashgraph, like the devs, one of the main focus, it seems like, with Hedera Hashgraph is to make it this kind of enterprise, this business-oriented protocol, then we can actually, as investors, figure out how much dollar inflows are coming into the network. And that can just give us a better sense of what might be a reasonable value to be putting on the network. If we start seeing a big explosion in transactions on the network, that could just suggest that there's this more guaranteed inflow of money that could cushion the price of HBAR on the downside if it's falling, because again, that amount of money is flowing in no matter what the price of HBAR is. But then also, the transaction fees aren't going to get more expensive as HBAR goes up, which is not going to disincentivize more companies from adopting it on the back end. So in my opinion, I just think it's a really clever system. I think it's something that situates Hedera Hashgraph in a unique way for enterprise adoption, that any kind of workflow that requires high numbers of transactions, HBAR looks a lot more appealing because you're not having to worry about other businesses coming in and starting to buy the token. You're not having to worry about the price of the token at all to budget this into your use case. And also the fees on Hedera Hashgraph are just so cheap, even relative to other what are now considered cheap chains like Avalanche. That just seems to make a lot of sense. And so if we see more of that adoption, it would make sense that HBAR could benefit from that from businesses. But again, we haven't really seen that yet. I think HBAR it's still got something to prove in terms of enterprises actually adopting it in that way. But it's a chain that it's a protocol that makes a lot of sense for enterprises to do that. So if this becomes an area where enterprises do move more into the Web3 space, or have workflows that they want to use a distributed ledger for, Hedera Hashgraph could offer a nice opening. And that's where I see the importance of this transaction fee mechanism being, is that it situates Hedera Hashgraph in a unique way for enterprises, but it also allows us to just literally calculate what is kind of the base amount of dollar inflow that's going into HBAR based on its usage. All right, if you like the content, remember to subscribe to the channel, give the video a like, and follow us on Twitter. Put out a lot of updates over there about our indicators and more.